Well, welcome. My name is Jayne Meyncke, and I teach a variety of things here at the St. Constantine School. I teach third grade math and literature, and I also teach a theater arts class for high school and junior high, and I also pinch hit in great books for every now and then. So wear a lot of different hats. But today I'm going to be talking about something I like to call interpersonal architecture. So each day when my theater students gather for rehearsal, we engage in a set of exercises. These range in difficulty from the very simple vocal warm-ups wherein you sing a series of nonsense words to the very difficult. Be aware of everything around you all at once with every part of yourself and jump up and down. When I ask them to do this last one, depending on the day, they often groan because as simple as the act of jumping might seem, they know that this is an endeavor fraught with peril. The structure of the exercise itself is quite simple. Stand in a circle, pay attention, and without signaling anyone or using any cues, decide as a group to jump. Easy peasy, right? I have seen groups take up to 4 hours to complete this exercise successfully. But I've also seen groups take less than 20 minutes, and some groups that never get it. My students worked on this yesterday, and they worked at it diligently for about half an hour without ever quite getting in sync. It was always too obvious which of them had gotten impatient and led the charge, or which of them had let their attention drift and was a half a step behind. It was a day when the structure of the exercise and the participants were out of step with each other. But the days when this exercise works are truly magical. There's a palpable energy in the room. They're working to communicate with each other without using any signals or language, just by broadcasting their desire to jump, by opening their awareness to the smallest movement of the entire group. They're able to act corporately as one body. On days when this works, I look at them and I think, that's what worship should look like. I had a parent remark to me last semester that the productions I've directed seem different from other shows they've experienced, more communal, even when there was no audience participation expected. To me, this was a really great compliment because it means that what we practice in rehearsal, real listening, real awareness, was being broadcast to our audiences. That the audience was able to come alongside us in the experience of the performance, to feel that they were integral to what was happening, not just in front of them, but in the same space. This is a goal I have as a director always, to create art that gives both the artist and the viewer purpose. Audiences have their own role, their own energy that makes each performance entirely unique. Students new to theater are often surprised about the difference an audience makes to their own experience of performing. How audiences will laugh in what seems like an odd place, throwing off the expected rhythm of the scene, or how some audiences won't respond at all to the action on stage, bringing no energy of their own to the room. Audiences make up a vital part of the communal live performance that is theater. They have the ability to influence that moment in time and space simply by their willingness to participate in that immediate shared experience. Each new audience brings with it a new community, a new opportunity to be there together, here and now, there and then, seeing together and feeling together, a thing which has never happened before and will never happen again. Theater properly accomplishes the incarnation of the intangible. It allows a previously empty space to be transformed. It gives it structure and guides the experience of the performer and observer alike. Historically, we've relied on physical architecture to structure and influence our experiences of and within a space. We set apart certain locations and say, these ones are different. This place is special. Spaces are rendered sacred both through their being set apart as distinct from other types of space and also for the ways in which they place a group or individual in proximity to the source of power. For Christians, the act of worship often demands a certain amount of locational distinction. Pilgrimages to holy sites remain an active part of the Christian experience, and I would argue that this is because we ourselves are not amorphous worshipers. We exist in time and space. We pray to something and inhabit corporeal bodies that demand physical space. So it seems appropriate that our understanding of eternal things, of holy things, is often tied to a physical location or object. As Christians, we speak of corporate worship, worshiping as one body. We have the biblical analogy of the church functioning as the body of Christ. We have the incarnation of the Word. And we also have examples like the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, specific and beautifully created things that housed God's presence. So much of our spiritual understanding is dependent on physicality. I'm going to tie in Plato, because at this school you get fired if you don't mention Plato in a lecture. So no Plato scholars come for me, though. The dialogue Timaeus posits that the universe and all it contains was crafted against an eternal model, that which is changeless. Now, properly unpacking that is an entirely different lecture for my purposes. What I take it to mean is that created matter is modeled on an eternal principle, namely God. In my version, Timaeus agrees with me and goes on to say that it follows by unquestionable necessity that this world is an image of something. We also find this language biblically. We are created in the image of God, and we double down on this idea when we ourselves create things, image begetting image. Here we find philosophical precedent for the idea that physical manifestations, created things, are eternally representative. In this sense, then, even church buildings serve as a physical symbol, an image, to use Platonic language, of God's presence, while at the same time participating fully as an iteration of that presence. So how does this underlying principle affect the physical architecture of sacred space? Do ugly churches have lesser participation with God? It seems that they still participate in God's presence. They just are maybe a more imperfect union. But if churches do not, in their very form, move the soul toward God through participation in his beauty, are they properly sacred? The buildings shouldn't matter, right? Just our bodies or nature, real creation. These questions present themselves if we begin to subscribe to the idea that the visible world, by extension the physical and created world, is unimportant in and of itself, even as an image. This creates both an unnecessary divide between the revealed image of God and his creation, those Platonic iterations of the eternal, and a divide between the appreciation of created beauty and the worship of God. But often the visible world is a means of experiencing God, not just a tool for directing worship towards him, never to be looked at again. The beautiful architecture of a building isn't a distraction, it's part of the whole point. Michael Camille in Gothic art, Glorious Visions, elaborates on this idea, saying that it is the relationship between vision and knowledge for which Aquinas had argued in his Summa Theologica. Just as we still use the phrase I see to mean I understand, for Aquinas the word visio meant more than just vision. This term, he writes, in view of the special nature and certitude of sight, is extended in common usage to the knowledge of all the senses, and it is even made to include intellectual knowledge, as in Matthew 5:8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Something like the Pisa altarpiece, like most Gothic images, was not considered primarily as a work of art by its contemporaries, but as something far more powerful and instrumental, because of its capacity not just to reflect the world, but to reshape it into God's image. So we see how the ability to physically see influences a theological precept, the ability to comprehend and experience God. Art, like creation, does not just act as a mirror or an arrow. It does not stand in a void. Art, like creation, acts on the world that it imagines, shaping the world around itself to manifest as close an image as we can get to the real thing, all the while containing elements of the thing itself. If Timaeus is right, art is the thing it depicts. Magritte was wrong. It is a pipe. And our viewing of a thing, viewing it with what Aquinas calls the knowledge of all our senses, plays a significant role in our understanding of the thing and our participation in it. In this way, churches are uniquely positioned as some of the most artistic and beautiful places in the world, and many of them are. Cathedrals throughout the world stand as monuments to the importance of beauty in physical structure. Gothic architecture, for example, built and shaped a world in which form mattered in worship. John Harvey in the Gothic world puts it succinctly, as above, so below. The activities of the creator were reflected and echoed in the works of human artists, and those works depended for their utility, durability, and beauty upon properly composed geometrical relations, which I learned tonight are Euclidean geometrical relations. The more you know. It's impossible to enter into these spaces and not be physically overawed, which is an exact reflection of the way in which we spiritually enter into God's presence. Their vaulted forms were an incarnation of the mathematical glory of creation, something that we learned a little bit more about tonight. In a 2011 interview, Roberta Amundsen put this tension into a modern context. Those early Christians who had the heavenly Jerusalem on the arch over the altar were living in the present reality of the coming reality. And that's what sacred space is all about, where you understand that it isn't just now and it isn't just material. We don't live in a world that is merely material, but we live in a world that was created by someone who loved matter. God created this tension within us, but it's also a wonderful unity. Amundsen highlights this very important idea that we exist in tension. We are part eternal, part created. We physically see and mentally comprehend. Matter is both itself and a promise of things to come. Church buildings, especially cathedrals, were long considered the artistic center of a community. A cathedral was, for some, the only kind of art they would ever experience. It was also one of the few places where a community could act corporately, could experience something on a relatively even playing field. They went to church because that was the clearest representation of the eternal that was available. But as beauty and art became more available, as life got a little less feudal and a little more commercial, as education got a little worse and a little more widely available, the emphasis on private enjoyment and experience won out over communal experience and interpretation, particularly in worship. There's a movement from an emphasis on the importance of the physical space in which we worship and the experience that guides us into, to an emphasis on the experience that individuals create in themselves when they worship. We move away from cathedrals and away from liturgy into warehouses and emotionally driven worship sessions. And before you think, wow, she's really going to go after the whole non-denominational thing, I want to add a small caveat that I believe that God can move in any space in any community, while at the same time firmly believing that the space in which we worship and our awareness of our physical nature is important. What I'm advocating for is a return to an awareness and reinforcement of the structures that enable the kind of freedom that many postmodern church communities operate in as a matter of course. That kind of freedom can often act as a paralytic. What do you do if you lack artistic ability? If you simply weren't educated to appreciate geometry and symmetry in either art or music? What if, as we often find in students these days, you refuse to even acknowledge that beauty is an eternal and recognizable thing? What if church just doesn't feel worshipy? The elevation of the individual experience places an inordinate importance on the individual's ability to consistently incarnate those elements of the eternal which are necessary to experience God, but cannot always be found in the individual. I'll say that again. The elevation of the individual experience places an inordinate importance on the individual's ability to consistently incarnate those elements of the eternal, which are necessary to experience God, but cannot always be found in the individual. The experience of a church service can sometimes feel isolating in this way. If we aren't able to manufacture the appropriate feeling, if we find ourselves distracted during the service, then what are we supposed to do to refocus ourselves? That PowerPoint is not going to cut it. The transition from the building as sacred space to the self as sacred space means that instead of an emphasis on the space being beautiful and allowing that to guide our response, we ask that our experience inside the space be beautiful, and we delve even further inwards in an attempt to access the eternal, when what might actually help is looking outward toward other created things, even towards the community that so often accomplishes the work of architecture. What we want to see is the incarnation of the eternal, and what we are continually confronted with is ourselves. This is where I think theater can help us. The particular kind of theater that I practice with our students is called viewpoints, and one of its founders, Anne Bogart, explains that in beginning viewpoints work, one cannot avoid seeing oneself. Individuals become hyper-aware of all sorts of things, from how much they stand outside of themselves to how delayed their reaction time is, to how they hate the length of their arms or the bounce of their walk. The mirror becomes so big and horrifying. Self-consciousness is a kind of prison, but consciousness is freedom. Self-consciousness of this kind is a product of that insistence on looking only at our own experience to interpret the world around us, looking too closely, too critically at the self instead of allowing the self to become part of a larger experience. Not lost because your long arms and bouncy walk are necessary to the whole picture. You as a created thing are beautiful, and your particular beauty is necessary for the community's understanding of beauty. The consciousness Bogart wants viewpoint students to arrive at is one in which the whole body is employed in relation to the world around it, a hearkening back to Aquinas' equation of sight and knowledge. The exercises we practice in theater encourage us towards a state we call soft focus, where you're both aware of your entire being and your relationship to everyone else around you. You see everything, you take in everything, so you understand everything. You should ideally be able to walk around a room with your eyes closed and never run into anyone because you're listening with your whole body. I have yet to get a group of teenagers to this point, but I believe in them. I think we'll do it eventually. I think the thing that this parent was noticing in the plays that we've done here is this kind of active listening. It's an awareness and focus on the self that actually serves as an invitation to others, that brings them in and builds on their own awareness to create a new experience together. In this way, actors stand in the gaps for their colleagues. No one is left alone on stage because someone is, broadly speaking, always paying attention to you, feeding into and off of your experience of this particular moment in time and space. It's a kind of experiential unselfishness that also demands total commitment. The times when the counting or jumping exercises fail, it's because someone is dialed out. They're not allowing the structure to work on them. Much in the same way that a cathedral dictates use and response, the time when you allow the structure of the activity, the service or the worship session or the liturgy, or even the people around you to work on you unself-consciously, that's when you allow yourself to be present in a moment entirely and listen and participate with those around you in this act of communion with the eternal. And each time is different. Theater mimics this action. It creates a kind of interpersonal architecture in which you participate simply by being present at that time in that place. I believe that the goal of all art, whether performative or static, is an image of the goal of creation, which is to worship the Creator. Buildings are important because they house communities. Sacred spaces are important because they place that community close to the Creator, just as communities are important because they house individuals and bring the individual closer. And if all I've accomplished at the end of a semester of rehearsal is creating a space where a group of students can truly listen to each other and be aware of the world around them, then I think there's hope that they can encounter God in whatever space they're in. Thank you.